All right, so welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be taking a look at the future of Syrian refugees in Europe. This is obviously a hot topic, especially after the recent collapse of Bashar al-Assad's regime. And for this deep dive, I've got a ton of sources that you sent over, news reports, discussions from various YouTube channels, all sorts of different perspectives. So let's just dive in and see what we can learn.
Yeah, the speed at which everything changed is really remarkable. I mean, it wasn't like this slow decline. It was bam, Assad's out, and suddenly you have this vacuum and all these rebel groups rushing in, including Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS.
It does make you wonder, like, did anyone actually predict this? I mean, Assad held on to power for so long through years of conflict.
Most of the sources I've seen, even the experts, they were completely caught off guard. Most people were predicting like a long, drawn-out fight, not this quick shift in power. So yeah, it really leaves everyone wondering, especially all the Syrian refugees who've been living in limbo all over Europe.
It's interesting looking at the sources. You see this real roller coaster of emotions from the Syrian refugee community. At first, there's this huge outpouring of joy, relief, almost like they can't believe Assad's actually gone.
Yeah, some of those videos you sent are incredibly powerful. That Syrian restaurant owner in London who's already like, I'm going back to rebuild. And that journalist in the UK, he talks about finally feeling hope after years of hearing Assad's regime. It really gets to you.
And there's that one from the Syrian embassy in Berlin, that woman just overcome with emotion, thanking Germany for their support. It's a good reminder of what freedom actually means to people who have lived under oppression for so long. But then going through the sources, you see this initial euphoria kind of giving way to some very real concerns about what this all means for them.
It's that honeymoon phase, right? The weight's lifted, everyone's optimistic, but then reality sets in and all the complications become clear.
So what are some of those complications? What are the sources saying about the main concerns?
I think the biggest one is safety. Is it actually safe to return to Syria? Even though Assad is gone, the country is still completely devastated from years of war. The sources talk about the lack of basic infrastructure, hospitals, schools, sanitation, it's all gone. Trying to rebuild from that level of destruction, it's a monumental task.
Like trying to piece together a broken mirror, even if you find all the pieces, it's never going to be the same.
And that's just the physical damage. We haven't even touched on the psychological impact, the fear of retribution, or the uncertainty about what kind of government will emerge from all of this.
And then you have HTS, right? A lot of the sources, especially the Western media and some of the more critical YouTube commentators, they're really concerned about HTS's ideology and their potential impact on Syria's future.
Right, and we can't forget that both the EU and the US consider HTS a terrorist organization. Having them as part of the new power structure raises a lot of questions about human rights, religious freedom, the whole stability of the country. And this isn't just theoretical. The sources point to HTS's past human rights abuses and their very strict interpretation of Islamic law as major red flags.
So for Syrian refugees watching this unfold from Europe, it must be such a confusing mix of hope and fear. On one hand, their homeland is finally free from Assad, but on the other, they have no idea what comes next.
It's a really difficult situation, and the sources really show the emotional toll it's taking on everyone. You see it with that Syrian man in Germany. He desperately wants to go back, but he's terrified for his family's safety. And then there's that young refugee in Turkey. She's determined to rebuild and find her missing mother. Their stories really encapsulate the human cost of all this geopolitical upheaval.
And then to make things even more complicated, you have how European governments are reacting to the situation. Looking at the sources, there seems to be this overall shift towards stricter immigration policies across the board.
Absolutely, and it's fascinating to see how this is all playing out. You have Germany, they initially took in almost 1 million Syrian refugees back in 2015, but now they're freezing all decisions on new asylum applications. And then you have Austria, they're even discussing giving Syrian refugees financial incentives to go back, basically encouraging them to leave.
It makes you wonder what's really driving these policy changes. Is it just a response to what's happening in Syria, or is there something else going on?
Well, if you look at the political climate in Europe, things have definitely changed since 2015. There's this growing anti-immigrant sentiment in a lot of countries, fueled by concerns about the economy and cultural integration.
And with elections coming up in several European countries, those anxieties are being exploited by political parties on both sides. It makes you question whether these decisions are really about the well-being of refugees, or if it's all just political maneuvering and trying to appeal to certain voters.
That's the million-dollar question, and it brings up some serious ethical and legal considerations. We can delve into those a bit later, but first, let's take a closer look at the specific arguments being made for and against these policy changes.
Yeah, let's see what the sources have to say about those arguments and what they could mean for the future of Syrian refugees in Europe. So we're seeing all these policy shifts happening in Europe, kind of a mixed bag. What are the sources saying about the arguments for and against these changes?
Well, there are definitely some strong voices on both sides of this debate. On one hand, you have these humanitarian organizations and legal experts, and they're raising some serious concerns about these policy changes. They argue that these quick decisions to freeze asylum applications or push for returns are going against international law and could put refugees in danger.
Oh yeah, there was a YouTube video that international law professor was explaining non-refoulement, the idea that countries can't send refugees back to places where they might face persecution. That was really eye-opening.
Exactly. That's a crucial point. A lot of the sources, the legal analyses and human rights reports especially, they emphasize that countries have a legal obligation to look at asylum claims on a case-by-case basis. They shouldn't just issue these blanket bans or pressure refugees to go back before it's safe. And with all the instability in Syria right now, the lack of basic necessities and the whole HTS situation, going back could be incredibly dangerous for a lot of people.
It seems like a lot of this comes down to balancing national interests with humanitarian obligations. It's a tough one. You have these concerns about border security, the strain on social services, the potential for unrest. But then you also have this moral obligation to help people fleeing violence and persecution.
You hit the nail on the head. That tension is at the heart of this whole debate. And it's playing out in the political sphere, too. You have politicians, particularly on the right, using this strong rhetoric about closing borders and limiting immigration. They're tapping into these anxieties about cultural change and economic instability, saying that Europe has done enough and can't take on any more responsibility.
But then you have those arguing that Europe has this historical and moral obligation to provide refuge. They point to lessons learned from past conflicts, the whole idea of human rights and international cooperation that the EU is supposed to stand for. It's such a complicated ethical dilemma. No easy answers.
Definitely not. And it's all happening against this backdrop of increasing pressure on Syria's neighbors. Countries like Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, they've been hosting the majority of Syrian refugees for years now. They're struggling with limited resources and rising tensions, and their governments are calling on the international community, especially Europe, to step up and do more.
It feels like everyone's passing the buck, and in the meantime, it's the refugees who are stuck in the middle, waiting and wondering what's going to happen to them. It's easy to get lost in the numbers, but the sources you sent really highlight the human cost of this crisis. We're talking about real people, people who have lost everything, who have experienced unimaginable trauma, and who are now facing this impossible choice. Do they stay in a place where they might not be fully accepted, or do they go back to a homeland that's still unstable and dangerous?
Those personal stories are so important. They remind us that this isn't just about politics, it's about people's life. That Syrian man, Germany, who's torn between wanting to go home and fearing for his family's safety. The young woman in Turkey who dreams of rebuilding her life in Syria but doesn't know if she can ever truly feel safe there. Their stories give a human face to this whole complex geopolitical situation.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the policy debates and all that, but at the end of the day, this is about individuals and families. And, looking at the sources, they also show the resilience of the human spirit. Despite everything they've been through, so many of these refugees still have hope. They still believe that things will get better, whether that means going back home or starting a new life somewhere else.
That resilience is incredible. It really is. It speaks to the power of hope, even in the face of unimaginable hardship. And it's a good reminder that even though things look bleak right now, there's still a chance for a positive outcome, a future where Syrian refugees can rebuild their lives and find peace and security.
So given what we know from the sources, what are some possible scenarios for the future? Where could all of this be heading?
Well, one possibility is that the new government in Syria manages to stabilize things, rebuild the country, and make it safe for refugees to voluntarily return. That's the optimistic outcome, but it would require a major commitment from the international community. Not just financial aid, but also real political support. And a lot of the sources point out that that kind of commitment has been missing in the past. The world's attention tends to shift to the next crisis pretty quickly.
It's like we have a collective case of ADD, We get outraged, we promise to help, and then something else happens and the old crisis gets forgotten.
I think that's a pretty accurate analogy, but the Syria refugee crisis is so big, so complex, it can't just be ignored or forgotten. Millions of lives are at stake, and the decisions made in the coming months and years will have huge consequences, not just for Syria and its neighbors, but for Europe and the whole world.
So what can we do as individuals who are aware of this situation? How can we actually make a difference?
I think the first step is to stay informed, keep learning. Keep seeking out diverse perspectives. Don't just rely on mainstream media. Look at sources like the YouTube channels you shared. They offer a wider range of viewpoints and personal experiences. It's also important to hold our elected officials accountable, ask them tough questions about their policies and how they're addressing the needs of refugees both here and abroad.
And there are ways to get involved on a more personal level too, right? Supporting organizations doing humanitarian work, volunteering time to help resettle refugees in our communities, educating ourselves and others about the situation. These are all things we can do.
Absolutely, every action counts, no matter how small. This isn't just a political issue, it's a human issue. It's about empathy, compassion, recognizing the shared humanity that connects us all.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. Imagine you're a Syrian refugee, facing that impossible choice of whether to stay or go back. What factors would you consider? How would you weigh the risks and opportunities? And what kind of future would you hope for, both for yourself and for your homeland?
That's a really powerful question. It forces us to move beyond the abstract and try to understand what it's actually like to be in their shoes, to be directly impacted by this crisis. And maybe, just maybe, by doing that, we can find a way to move forward with greater understanding, compassion, and a commitment to building a world where everyone, no matter where they come from, has the chance to live a safe and dignified life.
Well, this has been quite the deep dive, so much to unpack. We started with Assad's regime collapsing, totally out of the blue, throwing everything into chaos. Then we looked at how Syrian refugees are reacting, all those mixed emotions, hope, fear, trying to figure out what it all means for them. And on top of that, we have European governments. Well, their responses are a bit complicated, seem to be more about politics than humanitarian aid.
Yeah, it's been a lot, for sure. But going back through the sources, what really gets to me is the human side of it all. It's easy to get bogged down in the politics, the policies, all the numbers, but we're talking about real people here. Families, people with dreams, forced from their homes, trying to make it in a world that's often pretty hostile.
The sources you sent really drove that point home. That Syrian man in Germany, trying to decide if he should risk going back to Syria, which is still unstable, or stay in a country that doesn't really want him. And the young woman in Turkey wants to rebuild her life back in Syria, but she's still dealing with all the trauma. Those stories really stay with you. It reminds you that behind all the news and political talk, there are real people whose lives have been completely upended by this conflict.
Right, and it's not just those individual stories. There's a whole generation of Syrians who've experienced this collective trauma, kids who's only known war, families torn apart, a whole society dealing with the scars of violence. The interviews and documentaries you sent, they really capture that deep trauma, the lasting impact it's going to have on everyone, individuals, families, Syrian society as a whole.
It makes you think about the responsibility we all have, not just countries, but regular people too, to respond to this with empathy and actually try to find solutions that put people first.
I totally agree, and I think the sources do give us some ideas about how to move forward. There's a lot of talk about needing a real international response, one that goes beyond just sending aid and actually tackles the root problems, things like political instability, economic inequality, human rights
Oh,
violations.
I remember that think tank report. They had some pretty innovative ideas about resolving the conflict and rebuilding peace in Syria. They talked about inclusive dialogue, getting all parts of Syrian society involved to come up with a shared vision for the future.
That's so important. Lasting peace can't be forced on people. It has to come from within. It means creating opportunities for dialogue, reconciliation, healing, where Syrians from all walks of life can address the issues that led to the conflict and try to build a future based on respect and understanding.
That's going to take time, though, right? Healing and rebuilding, it's not an overnight thing.
Absolutely. Rebuilding a broken society takes generations, not just a few years. The international community needs to be in it for the long haul, not just with money, but with political will and expertise. The sources highlight how important it is to invest in education, healthcare, infrastructure, economic development to give Syrians a chance to rebuild their lives and create a better future.
And that support needs to extend to Syrian refugees in their host countries, too, right? Give them access to education, healthcare, job opportunities, so they can support themselves and contribute to their new communities.
Exactly. Integration has to go both ways. It takes effort from both sides. The sources talk about how important it is to have programs that promote cultural understanding, language skills, job training, so refugees can integrate and build new lives.
So wrapping up this deep dive, I'm feeling kind of, well, hopeful, but also a little apprehensive. Hopeful because the sources do point to some ways forward, solutions that could lead to a better future for Syria. But apprehensive because the challenges are huge and there's no guarantee things will work out.
I think that's a very reasonable way to feel. It's a complex situation. It's constantly changing. It's going to require us to stay engaged. But I do think the sources we've looked at today give us a good starting point for understanding what's going on and what we can do.
Well, thank you so much for walking us through all of this. I know I learned a lot, and I hope our listeners did too.
It's been my pleasure. Really enjoyed it. And remember, just because this deep dive is ending doesn't mean the conversation has to stop. Keep learning, keep asking questions, keep engaging with this issue. However you can, the future of Syria depends on it.
And to our listener, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this gave you a better understanding of the Syrian refugee crisis and maybe even inspired you to get involved and help create a more just and compassionate world. Yep.